Hi AP. Okay, today we are going to start day one of part writing using second inversion triads. Congratulations on making it this far. All right, so now it's time to learn a new principle. This is our fifth principle. When a triad is in second inversion, double the bass. Second inversion means that the fifth is in the bass. Okay, so make sure you copy that down. Principle 5, when a triad is in second inversion, double the bass. Okay. So, as far as rules of voicing and doubling are concerned, you already know that when in root position to double the bass or the root. You also know that when you are in first inversion and you're dealing with a major or minor triad, you are to double the soprano. You should also know that diminished triads should be used in first inversion only. And when you are dealing with diminished triads, you want to be sure to double the bass, which is the third of the triad for first inversion. And here it is again. When in second inversion, double the bass or the fifth. That way you get a doubled dominant. Okay, let's proceed further. When we see the 6/4 underneath for figured bass, that means we are dealing with second inversion triads. If it's just a 6 under the bass, then it's first inversion. If there's nothing there, then it's root position. So these three chords are in what inversion? Hopefully you said second because we have the 6 and the 4. And we need to take a look carefully and make sure that we are following the figured bass guidelines. We have the first chord here is a 6/4 chord with a slash through the 6. So I'm going to go up 6 from my bass note. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which brings me to the C. And I have to sharp it or raise it because of the slash. And it looks like that voicing is for the soprano. So this is for soprano. The 4, underneath that, it means to go up a fourth from the lowest note, and it looks as if the tenors are singing the A. So if you look carefully at the first triad, what note is doubled? Well, it looks to be like the E is doubled right there with the alto. So let's try to build this triad and figure out what the root is and what the fifth is and what the third is. Well, clearly if you see a 6/4, then right away the red flag should sound and it should tell you that we're in second inversion, which means that this E right here in the bass is going to be the fifth. So that means we need to find the third and the root. So if E is the fifth, then it looks as if, according to the figured bass, our C sharp is going to be the third, and our root is going to be the A. So this happens to be an A major triad in second inversion because the fifth, or the E, of the A major triad is in the bass. And when a triad is in second inversion with 6/4, we should remember from the principle, double the bass. So that's why you have two E's here. And then you have one other voice singing the root, in this case tenor, and the other voice singing the third, the C sharp, in this case the soprano. Let's look at our next 6/4 chord, shall we? So it looks to be like an F sharp in the bass, and then we have a D in the tenor, and we have a B. If I put the B here, that's not going to be the correct triad. But if I slide the B over here, I'm dealing with a B, D, F sharp triad. Another easy way of telling that this triad is in second inversion is because you see the 6-4 right here in the figured bass. That gives it away immediately. That means that the F sharp, the bass note, is the 5th of this triad. If the F sharp is the 5th of this triad, then the D has to be the 3rd, and the B natural has to be the root. So this is a B minor triad in second inversion because my B, D, F sharp is the triad, and my F sharp, which is the 5th, is in the bass. And when we have a second inversion triad from the principal, we are going to double the bass. In this case, the soprano is doubling the bass. And the other two voices, the alto and the tenor, are supplying the root and the 3rd. In this last example, we've got a C in the bass, a C in the tenor, an F in the alto, and an A flat in the soprano. Why A flat, you ask? Well, let's look at our figured bass. Right here we have a flat 6. If we go up 6 notes from the lowest note, which is C, we'll land on an A. But the figured bass calls for a flat 6, so we lower it down. And it looks to be like the sopranos have that note. Right there. And then the 4 by itself, we don't have to do anything other than go up a 4th from the lowest note and put it in the voice of our choice. I made a rhyme. In this case, the 4 is represented in the tenor voice. So I've got 2 C's, an F, and an A flat. This is a 6-4 because it's in the figured bass, meaning it's second inversion. So the bass should be doubled, and the bass is the 5th. So I know that the bass is the 5th, which is a C. That means the 3rd is going to be the A, and the F will be the root. A flat. This is an F minor triad with the 5th in the bass, which is C, making it a second inversion triad. So hopefully this is a lot easier than it was in the past, because we're getting more and more used to the figured bass numbers, what they mean, and the symbols. So all of these are second inversion triads with the 5th in the bass and a doubled dominant. Okay, please take out a piece of staff paper, make a grand staff, copy down the notes you see that are written for soprano, including the accidentals, and the notes that you see for bass, including the accidentals. Also copy down the figured bass underneath each of the 3 examples. We will need to find out some answers to these questions. You will need to identify the inversion of these triads, which notes need to be doubled, and provide the alto and tenor voices appropriately. So take some time to do this now, and I'll be back with you momentarily. Okay, let's check our work, AP. Hopefully yours matches mine. I realized right away that these triads were in second inversion because the 6/4 gave it away. You won't have that all the time in every case, especially if you have, let's say, a Roman numeral analysis or just a key signature and a bass note. But for now, we're just relying on this figured bass here. So the 6/4 tells you right away we're in second inversion. So I can answer the second question immediately by saying that the bass should be doubled. In this case, second inversion, that means the fifth of the triad is doubled. So then I figured out the figured bass. I went up and provided the necessary tones to complete the triad. Also made sure to adhere to anything that might be raised or lowered in my figured bass symbols. So in the first triad, we have a D major triad that is in second inversion because the A, the fifth, is in the bass. And notice that I've doubled the bass with the tenor voice in the first triad, the A. And then the alto and soprano are providing the root and the fifth. In our next triad, we have a B minor triad. The bass is the fifth, it's in second inversion, so I've doubled that with the tenors. And the alto and soprano are singing the root and the third of that triad. In the last chord, I'm given a B flat in the bass and figured bass of 6/4, so I know the B flat is the fifth because the 6/4 tells me I'm in second inversion. Count up 6 from the B flat, and I can land on a G and put that in the tenor voice, as I've done. The sopranos are singing the E flat, so the only tone that needs to be left is the proper doubling. In this case, the B flat, sung by the altos. Therefore, making this triad an E flat major triad in second inversion with the fifth, the B flat, in the bass. So hopefully this is making a little bit more sense now that we've gone through it. Okay, because second inversion triads are so rare, they only occur in certain situations. When we have them, we call them 6/4 chords. Why do you suppose we call them 6/4 chords for short? More on that later. There are 5 types of second inversion triads, or 6/4 chords, that we will be learning. So sometimes if I say 6/4 chords, I'm talking about second inversion. I will use the term second inversion and 6/4 chords interchangeably. So let's talk about the 5 types of 6/4 chords. First one we're going to discuss is the cadential 6/4. You can write the others down now, but we're going to focus mainly on the cadential 6/4. The second one is a passing 6/4. The third type of 6/4 chord is the pedal 6/4. And the fourth type of 6/4 chord is the arpeggiated. So hopefully some of these words seem to be making sense to you. When we hear cadential, maybe cadence pops into your mind, and cadence means the end of a phrase. When we hear the word passing, maybe we think of a tone in between 2 other tones in stepwise motion. When we hear the word pedal, perhaps that means to stay on the same note and keep it static. And when we hear arpeggiated, the first thing that comes to mind is a broken chord, maybe of like a root, third, fifth, 1, 3, 5 type of thing. And lastly, the fifth type of 6/4 chord. I will reveal it now. Wrong. There is no fifth type of a 6/4 chord. There's only 4. So now that I've got your attention, let's focus on the first type of 6/4 chord, the cadential 6/4. Let's take some notes. The cadential 6/4 chord will occur at cadences. Cadence is maybe a new vocabulary term for some and not new for others, but we should know that when we talk about cadence, we're talking about the end of a phrase. So the cadential 6/4 chord occurs at cadences. The cadential 6/4 chord will always be a 1/6/4 chord followed by a 5 chord in root position. The two chords will work together to form a 5 chord, and I'll show you what I mean. The cadential 6/4 chord is the final and most noticeable use of the 6/4 chord. Okay? In this form, the second inversion triad precedes a 5 chord in a cadence. So let's examine this. So here in our first measure, we have just a root position triad. That's fine. The bass is doubled, or the root. 4 chord, doubled root. Look at that nice smooth motion. Fantastic. Now we're in the second measure to the third measure. We have the 4 chord, and then we have a 1/6/4 chord. And the 1/6/4 chord is followed by a 5 chord for a cadential 6/4. And our 1/6/4 chord right here in measure 3 is a C, E, G with the G, the fifth, and the bass, and the G doubled by the soprano to the 5 chord. Often the cadence will sound stronger due to the cadential 6/4's presence. So let's listen to this harmonic progression. One more time. Often, the cadence will sound stronger due to the cadential 6/4's presence. So now, we're going to examine the cadential 6/4 chord and its resolution to 5. And there it is. We have the 1/6/4 to the 5 chord. We've kept the common tone in the same voice, in this case soprano, and we've moved the alto down to the nearest chord tone and the tenor down to the nearest chord tone. So that's our resolution to the 5 chord. That's how we're going to resolve the 1/6/4. Okay, this next part might sound confusing, but try to stay with me. Some theorists prefer to identify the cadential 6/4 chord as a 5 chord with 2 non-harmonic tones. Non-harmonic tones simply mean there's tones that are not in the triad, or that don't belong in the triad, or don't fit in the triad, meaning superimposed thirds. So some theorists prefer to identify the cadential 6/4 as a 5 chord, rather than a 1/6/4 to a 5 chord. In this case, in measure 3, we have a Roman numeral 5, which is in the key of C, G, B, D. However, we have the tenor and the alto not singing a B or a D. They're singing a C and an E. They often explicitly show the non-harmonic resolution in their analysis, such as this. So you might come across something like that. You might see something like that where you have the 5/6/4, and then in the next measure 5/3. It simply means that, watch the figured bass, and if we have the 6 above the lowest note in the 5 chord, which is the E, then there's the line that connects the 6 to the 5, which means it's going to go down 1 step. And same thing with the 4 to the 3, it will go down 1 step. So although we're not going to use this, you should be aware that it exists. Okay, so here is our chord progression chart. The cadential 6/4, if you look carefully, occurs in between predominance and dominance. Predominance meaning the 2 chord or the 4 chord, and the dominance meaning the 5 chord and the 7 diminished chord. So that's where you're going to want to place your cadential 6/4. Not anywhere, not randomly, but in that certain spot. A great place to have a 1, 6, 4 to a 5 is right after a 2 or a 4 chord. Okay, so let's just quickly go back and review everything that we've done on this page. So here is our harmonic progression, and we see that we have a cadential 6/4 in measure 3 and 4 because we're going from a 1, 6, 4 to a 5 chord. The important thing to remember in cadential 6/4 chords is that 1, 6, 4 to the 5 chord will be sol, sol when it comes to solfege syllables. So the bass is singing do, fa, sol, sol, do. See if you can hear that. And that's how we're going to resolve the cadential 6/4 chord. Remember that a cadential 6/4 chord will always be a 1, 6, 4 directly followed by a 5 in root position. And that creates sol, sol in the bass, eventually resolving to the 1 chord do. So let's do another recap of the cadential 6/4 chord. Okay, this is a key of C, and in a cadential 6/4 chord, the bass will sing sol, sol, which will lead us to a big tonic finish. So look here in the first 2 chords, we have a cadential 6/4, that's a 1, 6, 4, going to a 5 chord in root position. The cadential 6/4, the 5th is in the bass, and the 5th must be doubled. See the double dominant right there? Why is that a double dominant? Because G is dominant in the key of C. And that's where we get sol from. The second measure over here, the last 2 chords, is a cadential 6/4 to a 5/7 chord. So that will make more sense when we start talking about 7th chords as soon as we're done with triads and second inversion. Here are some other examples of cadential 6/4 chords. And you can see in the first example at the top here, we have the 2nd and 3rd chord serving as a cadential 6/4 chord. It looks like we're in the key of C because of the last chord is the Roman numeral 1. We start out with the 4 chord, FAC, root position, the F is doubled. And here is our sol, sol, do in the bass, which is our cadential 6/4. Notice the correct doubling of the second inversion triad. Notice that a 1, 6, 4 chord is always followed by a 5 chord in root position. In this second example below, don't be alarmed that the stem direction is a little bit off. That's called keyboard style. Keyboard style is where you have a grand staff and you have the bass part written alone in bass clef and the upper 3 voices in treble. Keyboardists rely on that a lot. This would not be for singing purposes. But this illustrates the cadential 6/4. As you can see, we have a 1, 6, 4. They're using full Arabic numerals here. A 1, 6, 4 to a 5, 5, 3 to a 1. By the way, speaking of Arabic numerals in the figured bass, there is no abbreviation for 6/4 chords. You must include 6, 4 in your Roman numeral analysis. If you leave it as just a 6, then it becomes confusing because, remember, 6 means alone first inversion. So that's why we have to have 6, 4 there. And you can clearly see in this progression the cadential 6/4 because you have sol, sol, do. So let's review the cadential 6/4 second inversion triad. Here are some review questions hopefully you can answer. Question 1, what is the symbol of a second inversion triad? Well, hopefully you said 6/4. What note do you double in second inversion triads? Hopefully you said the 5th. And then I could change this and I could also write what note or voice do you double? That would be the fifth or the bass. Why do we call second inversion triads 6/4 chords? Can we use 6/4 chords anytime we want to? And how many types of 6/4 chords are there? So these are all questions that you should be relatively comfortable at this point answering. 6/4 chords are called 6/4 chords simply because the fifth is in the bass and other voices are singing the sixth above the lowest note and the fourth above the lowest note, therefore making it a second inversion triad. We are limited with our use of 6/4 chords. We cannot use them anytime we want to. They are rare and happen infrequently and only in certain special spots. And there are 4 types of 6/4 chords. Hopefully you can recall some of them, especially the cadential 6/4, which we've spent some time on today. Cadential 6/4 chords are always which Roman numeral? 1, 6, 4, 5. Okay. So in the cadential 6/4, the 2 chords, the 1, 6, 4 to the 5, work together to sound like one big five chord. What does the bass look like when using a cadential 6/4? Sol, sol, do, or high do. You hear that 5, 5, 1, back to root. Where do cadential 6/4 chords occur? Right after these. And what is a cadence? Ending of a phrase. Here are more examples of cadential 6/4 chords. You'll recall that this is keyboard style at the moment because the bass clef has just one part, but you can clearly see that we have the 1, 6, 4, 5 chord in measure 2 ending on a big tonic finish with the 1 chord. You can clearly see that the bass is singing, or playing I should say, on the piano, sol, sol, do. This is a good review. Look at the second chord. You see C major, first inversion, because we have 1, 6, so the E is in the bass, the third, which means the soprano should be doubled, and that's why we have the 2 G's there at the top. Notice that the minor 2 chord precedes the cadential 6/4. That's exactly the right placement of where you want to have a cadential 6/4 chord. Okay, I think we're going to stop there, and hopefully this will get you started with your packet, and we'll pick up with more 6/4 chords and a review of the cadential 6/4 at some other time. And then we have to learn 3 more 6/4 chords. The passing 6/4 chord, the pedal 6/4 chord, and the arpeggiated 6/4 chord. Oh, and wasn't there one more? Oh, that's right. Wrong. There's only 4 types of 6/4 chords. Talk to you soon, AP. Have a great day.